Hello, my name is Bianca Burney, and I will be talking about life in a correctional institution. Before I go to the next slide, I just wanted to talk a little bit about what was in my introduction and about the population. So, the moment that young offenders are sentenced to prison, it's an uphill battle. Their life is difficult before even entering a correctional facility. For instance, many girls enter the system as runaways, and they're often running away from abusive households or abusive situations. Or they could have committed other offenses that would not have been illegal if an adult would have completed that offense. Different facilities have differing rules, cleanliness, and resources, which make it difficult for young people in correctional facilities because some might get great education, some might not. There's much controversy over this topic in general because many may feel like this population doesn't deserve help. Other populations at risk, like those experiencing poverty, health issues, war, maybe their parents are on drugs, these populations may seem like they deserve more help than the ones that have done something wrong and are in prison for it. There's also debates on whether young people should be placed in adult prisons or not, which I will get into that during the next slide. More males than females are likely to go to prison. I looked at a pie chart from 2010, which shows that Black males are 37%, white males make up 25%, Hispanic males make up 23%, and females make up 7.9%. while other males of mixed races make up 6%. Males are 16 times more likely to go to prison than females. I thought that was really interesting. I tried to find research on exactly why, and I'm not completely sure, but it certainly is staggering that females in total make up only 7.9% of that entire pie chart. As far as race, there are definitely more African American women than there are white or Hispanic women in prison. More African Americans are sent to adult prisons as well. From the years 1990 to 2010, adolescents going into adult prison went up by 230%. When adolescents go into adult prisons, there's a higher risk of many different things. Some of them being sexual victimization, mental health problems show up, suicide, which suicide becomes 36 times more likely, which is a lot, when adolescents are put in adult prisons. This especially can be seen when there's isolation. It's more likely for these young people to be put in isolation in these adult prisons because they want to protect these young people from the adults. So that can be incredibly lonely, and even though prison is not a fun place, obviously, being among people that you can relate to and being around people that are your same age definitely helps in that situation. And then another terrible thing about young people being put in adult prisons is that it goes on their adult record, which is a lot worse than if they were sent to a juvenile detention center. Then they will also have problems getting jobs after they are released, getting education. There's a debate where some people say it's better to keep adolescents out of jail just in general. And this is because young people who were incarcerated were 67% more likely to return to jail by the age of 25 than other young offenders who did not go to jail for the same crime. That means two people could have stolen something. If one person went to jail, they are highly likely to go back, whereas the other person who stole something, if they never go to jail, they are less likely to go to jail, and they are also less likely to commit crimes in the future, and especially violent crimes. This data came from Chicago, where 35,000 former public students were tracked, and they did an experiment there. Also, these same students that were tracked, it showed that 39% of them were less likely to finish high school when they went to adult prisons and then got out. Whether adult institutions or not, there's a great impact, meaning whether these young people go to juvie or adult prisons, their lives are going to be impacted greatly, both in and out of prison. 1/3 of people released will return shortly. Their earnings once they are released will be 10 to 30% less for up to 10 years after. Positive experiences, though, like good education, programs, and life events, can help these statistics and help combat these terrible statistics, and they can help people successfully go into society. So that's why I'm mentioning all of these things that can happen to these young people, not only inside the prison, but also when they leave, because it'll show that these programs that are needed in these prisons and reforms, they truly are needed, especially for the students who are in prison and they see, wow, like my family or my friends or these people are leaving and they aren't succeeding, then they are feeling defeated, which will make them not want to succeed and not want to try to get out and possibly just commit more crimes once they do get out. There are not proper tools or programs to combat mental health issues in facilities. This is needed because suicide is 4 times more likely in these prisons than other young people just in general who aren't in prison. It is most prevalent among girls and women. In fact, it can be seen as high as 80%, especially in isolation, as I talked about before. When you're put in isolation, it definitely takes a toll on your mental health. I did go to visit a correctional facility nearby our school, and it is where these young people go before they are sentenced, and this was state funded, and it seemed like a good place. We got a tour, and they told us about how there's mental health support there that looked really great, and just very supportive women there. And I would like to see that in all prisons and in all places, but unfortunately not all prisons and facilities are trying to transform and reform, which is a shame, and that's like another debate that we have in America. Like, should we just lock up prisoners, or should we try to transform them so they can go back into society? And this is an even tougher discussion when you are talking about young people, especially young people who may have committed a very terrible crime. So yeah, it's a pretty heavy topic. Educational implications. I had a hard time finding the curriculum that they have in prisons and the exact educational programs, but I did find data on whether institutions even test students or not, or young people, or whether they even evaluate students or not. So for public state facilities, they test and evaluate 90% of the people that come in, which was high and good, but the goal is still 100% because people are still falling through the cracks. When it goes to more of a local level or private institution, that percentage goes down a little bit. I think it's at about 85%. Still pretty good, but still needs some work. So that's very interesting because I think that states want to implement these good reforms, but not all places, not all prisons in these different counties and states follow these laws. The ones run by the state do a pretty good job of implementing them, but other ones not so much. So it's hard to tell. Some students, some young people get what they need and some don't, unfortunately. Shelters for when the students leave. For the year of 2014, shelters only evaluated 7 out of 10. So that's 70% of the people that come in. That is still very unacceptable. Not all institutions test for these educational levels, as I said. Education is really tough and it's really important because, as I talked about before in the previous slide, it is really hard for these young people to probably come from not so good education. They go into prison and then probably don't have very good education in prison, and then once they get out, how are they supposed to succeed if they are not taught the things that they need to be taught? In an article that I read, it said that most are at elementary level when they come into correctional facilities. Another statistic I have says 66% do not finish their education once they get out. The U.S. Department of Education and Justice provides 5 principles to provide quality education. So this is kind of the standard that they're hoping. I'm going to read one of those principles. It says that their goal is to recruit, employ, and make sure that they retain qualified staff. So that shows their goals for these correctional facilities. One of them is that they value having good teachers come into the prisons, which I think says a lot. Another question I had was about technology. The world that we live in is constantly going towards technology, and it's fast-paced and it's global, and especially for the people who live in poverty, it's hard for them to learn this technology. Probably especially in prison, the curriculum is not of the highest standard. Schools now are still updating technology. So that automatically puts these students at a setback as well if they aren't getting tested in that, because even when I was in elementary school, we had to go to computer class. And that's probably why I know Microsoft Word as well as I do today. So that's really hard and a setback, and I would have never thought of that originally. 1/3 of incarcerated youth read below a 4th grade level. So that statistic supports what I said earlier about how a lot come in at an elementary level educationally. And then what about the special ed students? It's hard for these prisons to take the time to diagnose these young people coming in, but these young people do have the same rights that other students do in public schools, which fall under the ADA, IDEA, and the 504 Rehabilitation Act. So all of these acts were passed by the government. And then there's some other reforms to improve re-entry into society. So I'm just going to name a few. Youth and family involvement, speedy placement, improved record transfer, improved school enrollment practices, appropriate placement, and dropout re-engagement programs. So these titles may be a bit vague, but they show the goals that these correctional facilities need to have and maybe trying to be forced to reinforce appropriate placement. If these students aren't going to an appropriate place after they leave the prison, then it's more likely that they will fail. So here are some different organizations that I found that were experts, and they are prepared to help prisoners and young people in prison and also leaving prison. So the first one is a Center for Educational Excellence in Alternative Settings, and they help alternative schools, in particular in community facilities and locked facilities, which implement, in quotation, transformational student-focused practices designed to significantly improve the life chances of the students they serve. And the next one is Juvenile Law Center. They focus on taking initiatives to help youth re-enter schools after prison. They promote policy to help youth in residential placement to be enrolled in appropriate schooling upon release. The next one is Southern Education Foundation. This one I thought was very interesting because they specifically help adolescents of color and low income, which, as I said before in the very beginning of this presentation, there's mostly people of color in these prisons. And their mission is to advance equity and education, which is what we need. So that's awesome. The next is the National Technical Assistance Center for the Education of Neglected or Delinquent Children and Youth. And they direct assistance to everyone who wants to know information about children and youth who are neglected, at risk, or a delinquent. This group is all about spreading information to everyone and anyone, which is great because the more advocates, the better. And the last one is Prison Fellowship. They are a Christian organization. They focus on restoring prisoners, empowering wardens who work at prisons, ministering to families, supporting successful reentry, and advocating for reform. I was very impressed by their website, and I think that Christian organizations should also be mentioned among this list. So I picked this topic because it's something that I've always been interested in. I could definitely see myself doing a prison ministry. And so whenever I'm talking to anyone about God, no matter who they are, I want them to know that they are heard and that they are loved. And so I just try to listen. And I would hope that if I was talking to a young woman, that we can connect, since I am a young woman, that we will be able to relate to each other, although we would be in different positions and places in life, I hope that that would make them feel more safe and comfortable. And I want them to know that they are important even though they are where they are. And so from there, I think I would go in to talk about how we are all equal in God's eyes, which can be found in James chapter 2, verse 1 to 5, and as well as the story of Philemon. So in James, it talks about how we are called to not show favoritism, and how God has chosen those who are poor in his sight to be rich in faith and to inherit the kingdom. So that talks a lot about the future and how important it is to have faith now, even though our situations may be poor. And then Philemon, that talks a lot about how Paul is advocating for this slave and this man in chains. And so he's putting this man in chains on an equal playing ground, and he's begging for his freedom. And I think that that's very powerful as well, which leads to the next one, freedom in Christ. Isaiah 42, 6-7. I, the Lord, have called you in righteousness. I will take hold of your hand. I will keep you and will make you to be a covenant for the people and a light for the Gentiles, to open eyes that are blind, to free captives from prison, and to release from the dungeon those who sit in darkness. So this talks a lot about, it even talks about prison and dungeon and darkness, which can be hard, but also very relatable to these people who are in these situations. And God is calling them, even though they are in prison. And granted, these verses do have specific context, which I hope that whoever I'm talking to would be open to, but I think that these verses are still good to share. And then John 8 talks about when Jesus sets you free, you are free indeed, which is another really strong thing. And it's good because even though they aren't necessarily free in this world, they can be free in Christ, and all of us are a slave to sin, whether we are in prison or not. Next is God can transform us. God has mercy on our people, on his people, and no one is beyond his reach, and I would want whoever I'm talking to know that. There are many biblical heroes who were once criminals or once sinful. Paul and Moses are really good examples of that. God wants to carry their burdens, and we can carry each other through fellowship as well. Hopefully, knowing that can combat some mental illness as well, as we saw, since that is very prevalent in the population of young people. Galatians talks about how we should not tire of doing good, and Romans talks about how God gives endurance and encouragement, which are two things that people in this population really need. Encouragement to keep enduring and to keep doing good and to keep going forward. And God has accepted them. It also says that in the Romans passage that God has accepted them. So I would hope that they would be open to hearing this and that they would be open to receiving Christ. But whether I would get this far or not, as far as sharing all these verses, there's still overarching themes that I could convey, and even just by listening and loving them, I think God can be shown and given the glory through that. So I hope that you learned a lot from this presentation. I know I didn't go too in depth on what education is like in the prison because that was hard for me to find, but this population is definitely at risk, and I believe that they deserve the same education that we all get, because how can we expect people to get better or to get saved or to have less people in prison if we don't transform them or if God doesn't transform them? So yeah, thank you.